Javier Milei assumed the presidency of the Argentine Republic on December 10th. Well, in his first full month of government, that is, in the month of January 2024, Milei has already achieved a budget surplus. The Central Administration of Argentina, also called federal or national, received more pesos in January than it spent. In particular, the total revenues in pesos for the month of January amounted to 6.1 trillion pesos, while the expenses, excluding debt interest, amounted to a total of 4.1 trillion pesos. This indicates that in the month of January 2024, Argentina recorded a primary surplus prior to computing the payment of debt interest amounting to a total of 2 trillion pesos. And due to the fact that the payment of interest on the debt totaled approximately 1.5 trillion pesos, all of this signifies that the surplus, after covering expenses and making the payment of interest on the debt, was ultimately 500 billion pesos. And don't think this is something minor, quite common in the national public sector of Argentina. The national public sector, the central administration of the country, has not been able to achieve a surplus after interest payments since August 2012, which marks a period of almost 9 years. To clarify, it was more than a decade ago when Peronism and radicalism were unable to achieve in a span of more than 10 years what they had set out to accomplish. And how did my law achieve it? Well, essentially the revenues of the Argentine state have increased at a much faster rate than expenses. To be more precise, the nominal revenues have experienced a multiplication of 3.5 times, whereas the nominal expenses have undergone a doubling in their monetary value. And how is it possible, firstly, that income is growing so much, and secondly, that it is growing more than expenses? The initial query is simple to respond to. Earnings are increasing not due to my legislation dramatically increasing all taxes, but rather as a result of inflation. Our conversation revolves around the increments in revenue in nominal terms as opposed to real terms. Actually, in actual terms, after adjusting for inflation, incomes barely increase. As we have mentioned, in January 2024, the nominal revenues of the Argentine state were 256% higher compared to the revenues of the Argentine state in January 2023. However, the total year-on-year inflation that has accumulated during that period is equivalent to 254%. This implies that in actual terms, the earnings of the Argentine state in the previous year have scarcely increased by 0.5%. The key to the generation of this budget surplus, thus, lies in controlling expenses effectively. In the past year, Jan 2023-Jan 2024, expenses of Argentina's national public sector rose by 114% in nominal terms. And naturally, if the total inflation during this time frame, as mentioned previously, amounts to 254%, that would be tantamount to a reduction in actual expenditure of over 15%. And how has Javier Milei managed to cut real spending so much? Well, on the one hand, because it has approved cuts in nominal spending. For example, it has paralyzed, suspended all spending on public works, or it has also practically eliminated discretionary transfers to provincial governments. That, on the one hand, nominal cut, not real, but nominal, of certain items of expenditure, and in turn, nominal freeze of other items of expenditure, such as the salary of public employees or pensions. If you freeze nominal spending while inflation continues to grow, that is equivalent to a real reduction in that spending, without cutting or decreasing it in nominal terms. And why is achieving a budget surplus so decisive, so significant, so important for the economy of the country of Argentina? Because it's the sine qua non for the monetary and financial reconstruction of the country. On the one hand, if the Argentine government has a persistent surplus, not only in the month of January, but also in the rest of the months of the year and the rest of the years from now on, then the Argentine government, to the extent that it is earning more than it spends, including financial expenses in the expenditure, then the Argentine government, as I say, becomes solvent. It possesses the capacity to repay its debt, and if the government of Argentina has the capacity to repay its debt, two things will occur. The first is that it will be able to issue debt in the financial markets under normal conditions if it needs to face any type of extraordinary expense. And the second, more important for what concerns us, is that it will have the ability to refinance the debt that it has already issued up to this point in time on more advantageous financial conditions, thereby reducing the payment of the interests that, as we have already seen, represents a very high percentage of all government expenses. Specifically, non-financial expenses of the central government are around 2 trillion pesos, and the interest 1.5 trillion pesos. Almost half of the budget of the Argentine central government goes to pay interest. Therefore, reducing that bill is essential in order to increase other expenses, or ideally, to lower taxes. Or else expenses will not be increased nor taxes lowered in order to further improve the solvency of the Argentine state. Due to the decrease in interest expenses, the financial surplus will increase even more as a result. And on the other hand, this financial surplus, if it has a persistent character, is the solution to the inflation problem in Argentina. Let's understand. In the month of January 2024, the central government of Argentina has generated an additional 500 billion Argentine pesos in revenue compared to its expenditures. What does that signify? What does that amount to? That signifies that the Argentine government has withdrawn a total of 500 million pesos from circulation solely in the month of January, because they have received them in surplus and have not utilized them again. Consequently, there is already a decline in the monetary supply in pesos. If inflation is a result of an excessive amount of currency in comparison to its demand, decreasing the currency quantity contributes to the stabilization of the value of that currency. However, it is not just that. To the extent that Argentine citizens develop expectations that the supply of pesos will not experience a drastic, excessive, or disproportionate increase in the future, and that the government will refrain from issuing pesos to finance its public deficit, it is crucial for them to believe. And these expectations can be formed because if the Argentine Gulf does not have a public deficit but a surplus, it will no longer need to print new pesos to finance the deficit. So, it is not just that the money supply in pesos is reduced, but it is also the case that the money demand in pesos will increase over time, leading to a potential imbalance in the economy. Due to the widespread expectation that the government will not need to utilize inflation as a means of financing itself, the peso gains strength as a currency, leading to increased willingness among people to maintain it in their treasury balance. Decrease in the supply of pesos and rise in the demand for pesos. All of this is attributed to the financial surplus, which results in the stabilization of the value of the peso and consequently brings about the end of inflation. Of course, as I mentioned, in order for all of this to come to fruition, it is imperative that the financial surplus is not only attained in January, but is consistently and repeatedly achieved throughout the remainder of the year and the subsequent years. However, it is worth noting that the fact that such a comfortable surplus has already been achieved in January, and that Javier Milei's intention is to ensure at least budgetary balance, certainly has changed market expectations significantly. And that is the reason why, over the past few days, two phenomena have occurred that are consistent with what I mentioned earlier. On the one hand, the perceived increase in the solvency of the Argentine state, and on the other hand, the stabilization of the value of the peso. On one hand, Argentine government bonds and Argentine public debt have experienced significant appreciation in the past few days. In other words, the market is anticipating a higher probability that those bonds will be paid off in full by the debtor. In this chart, for instance, we are displaying the cost of the Argentine bond in dollars for a duration of 30 years, and as we can observe, it is currently at its highest price since the year 2021. But also, as you can also see in this other graph, the parallel exchange rate of the dollar, measured in this case through the blue dollar, has been depreciating. That is, the peso has been appreciating against the dollar during the last few days. You can observe that the peso depreciated against the dollar, that is, the dollar appreciated against the peso during the first 3 weeks of January, and this was a consequence of Javier Milei's law on bases and starting points for the freedom of Argentines being knocked down, which generated some distrust in the markets about Milei's ability to govern and reform Argentina. However, now that it has been confirmed that, despite the blockade imposed by the legislative, Javier Milei is capable of balancing the accounts of the Argentine state, then the peso experiences a significant appreciation in value against the dollar. This is therefore the established path. The sole way, in fact. The financial surplus, or at least the budget balance. That is to say, Argentina does not spend more than it earns. If Javier Milei is capable of taking care of preserving this budgetary balance, let alone the financial surplus, in the medium term, then Argentina, as strange, as impossible as it may seem to us today, will enjoy price stability. So, Argentina will once again be perceived as a solvent state within the international community, and as a result, global capital will be willing, or at least willing, to enter Argentina without fear of being expropriated, either through nationalizations or through the imposition of inflationary taxes that erode their investments and returns. But for all this to be so, the surplus, as I stated, must not only be attained in January, and the challenge of my law will precisely be to preserve, to protect, to defend what it has already achieved in its first full month of government. Inflation has eroded a multitude of transfers, such as pensions, like public salaries, and these groups are going to commence exerting pressure to enhance those incomes in nominal terms, in order to regain and restore their diminished purchasing power. At the same time, the recession in the Argentine economy, derived not only from the necessary budget adjustment, but also from the opposition blocking the law on foundations and starting points for the freedom of Argentines, and therefore blocking the prospect of Argentina growing by attracting investments to deregulated sectors, this recession will also have a negative impact on income and further exacerbate the economic challenges facing the country. Thus, in the event that income is eroded in the future and expenses increase, it is possible that this budget surplus could quickly disappear without a trace. And if that is indeed the case, all the virtuous dynamics that we have witnessed and observed already unleashed will transform into vicious dynamics once again. The very same vicious dynamics in which Argentina has been trapped for the past few decades, with no signs of escape in sight. Therefore, let's hope that yes, as Javier Milei says, achieving zero deficit is non-negotiable.